So first and foremost, biosecurity is about keeping animals healthy. So if you start off with healthy animals, you've already got a great start. And that is the entire goal of biosecurity. We don't want diseases to spread to get other animals sick. We don't want sick animals to spread diseases to healthy animals. So always keeping in mind your herd population and how you are keeping that herd healthy to start with. So if you're buying animals, buy them from sources that you've had a good track record with. If you buy from a couple sources and your animals happen to get sick routinely, maybe you should consider going with another source or asking that source if they could add a vaccination, or what is their health protocol, what's the history on that herd to find out why those animals routinely get sick. Quarantine from the rest of your herd. So if you have a herd that's at home and you know those animals are healthy and you want to bring in a few extra breed stock, or you're bringing in just a group of market hogs to finish out for your customers, quarantining those from the rest of the herd is a good best management practice that is biosecure, but is at the foremost of keeping animals healthy. Having good relationships with your veterinarian. Veterinarians are most effective when they know what your animals are like when they are healthy. If you just bring an animal in when your animals are, or just bring a veterinarian in when your animals are sick, they're going to struggle a little bit more to give you best advice because they don't know what your animals look like when they're healthy. Always providing good nutrition, making sure your animals are well fed, and they have appropriate vitamins and minerals will keep them in a state of good health. Vaccination protocols, particularly for breeding stock or animals that are going to be on your property for a long period of time. There are appropriate vaccinations for finishing pigs, but a lot of that depends on at what age they're most susceptible and what exactly is on your farm. So having a customized vaccination protocol for your farm. And then a plan to treat animals when they do get sick. No one wants animals to suffer unnecessarily. You might not be able to utilize antibiotics in your system, but having a plan to deal with any animals that do get sick is another great way of the focus on keeping your animals healthy to start with in your biosecurity plan. And then of course, keeping the land healthy. We're going to talk quite a bit more about this in the talk, not specifically from the perspective of land, but the perspective of managing that pathogen load. And keeping healthy land will help keep dangerous pathogen loads to a minimum. I know in the diverse farming culture that you all appreciate, diversity is really important on your farm. You don't want to raise just one crop. You don't want to have just one type of plant or one type of animal in your operation. Same thing with the soil and the soil bugs. So any pathogen that's found naturally in the soil can become something that's dangerous. And any pathogen that's not necessarily found naturally in the soil can get in there and either be mixed in with the rest of the group and be diluted out and be less dangerous. Or it can just kind of be masked by other pathogens there. So keeping good soil health can help you manage that pathogen load. Similarly with keeping cover crops, again, good healthy soils are going to have a lot of diversity. They're going to have crops that grow well, and that's going to help keep those pathogen loads to a minimum. And then, of course, keeping clean water sources. So now if we have our animals and our land healthy to start with, let's talk about how pathogens and diseases move around. Biosecurity concepts and application are based predominantly around how diseases move. So it's either the idea of keeping as many diseases out of your farm as possible, or to just create a separation between diseases from getting onto your farm of already healthy animals. So we're going to talk about how diseases move. We're going to talk about lines of separation. Lines of separation, downtimes, and quarantines are all physical either places or states in which you are allowing a transition to happen from a place where there could be a disease to a place where you are trying to keep a disease out of. And basically, we refer to those two different states or places as clean versus dirty. So we'll talk about the application of utilizing a line of separation. For that line of separation to work and for that transition to work, we have to have an ability to clean things. So we're going to talk about what qualifies as cleaning for your operations and what are some of the more important things to keep clean, and how to actually facilitate cleaning on your property, particularly one where there's a lot of organic matter involved. Your animals are outside routinely. So keeping clean and dry in particular are really important. And then I've got some examples of some farms, and we'll talk about traffic patterns on farms and where cross-contamination can happen and how to help you avoid some of that. So in order to do these things, we're going to define them first. We're going to define how diseases move and define lines of separation. We're going to describe lines of separation and how to keep things clean and dry. And then we're going to demonstrate that on some images that I have where we're going to point some key factors out. So first we'll start with disease movement. You may have seen some of these signs on farms that you pass where it says this is a biosecure area, no unauthorized personnel. So this is one of those first steps in a lot of biosecurity plans where it's making that visitor path at least stop and pause. Should I be here? And if I should be here, have I taken the appropriate precautions to be here? But diseases in general don't really heed to those signs. I don't think I can imagine an E. coli bacteria seeing that sign and saying, oh, never mind, I gotta go the other direction. So pathogens themselves are moved around through animals, items, and people. Pathogens will attach to either an animal and get that animal sick and then be carried around by that sick animal. Some pathogens will not get those animals sick and they'll still be carried around. Birds are pretty famous for picking up pathogens and just carrying them from place to place without actually getting sick. You can have contaminated feedstuff. Your feedstuff might have picked up something that could make your animal sick. Even as simple as mycotoxin could be a breach of biosecurity because your feedstuff is now contaminated with mycotoxins. But when we talk about biosecurity, we're referring more to Salmonella, E. coli. I don't know if any of you know what PED is. PED is porcine endemic diarrhea virus. It was a virus that hit the swine industry pretty hard a few years ago. The fall of 2014, I believe, is when it hit, or the fall of 2013, I believe, is when it hit the hardest. And that pathogen, that viral pathogen, was believed to be transferred through feedstuffs. So feedstuff protocols, knowing where your feed is coming from to prevent the movement of that pathogen. Pathogens also move on equipment. So tractors are needed routinely to either move feeders through the field, to carry waterers out there, to move animals sometimes, to help you put up a fence, or wheelbarrows or wagons, any kind of equipment that rolls through your property, and particularly equipment that rolls through your property and goes off of your property from time to time, can be a fomite that can move pathogens around. And then finally, we have our boots on this picture, and that would signify either people or other items that can pick up pathogens just in day-to-day movements throughout the farm or on and off the farm. So from all of those different things that can move pathogens, there's good and bad news. The bad news is it's predominantly moved by people. So each one of those factors that can influence biosecurity and animal health are moved by people. Feed doesn't move itself. Sick animals don't necessarily move themselves unless it's wildlife. Boots don't move themselves, and tractors and wheelbarrows and wagons don't move themselves. So all of those things that, while the good news is we can identify some things that could be breaching biosecurity and bringing pathogens on and off your farm. The bad news is it's all because of human movements. And normally that's classified as poor biosecurity. Not paying attention to where you've been or what you've moved is considered poor biosecurity. And that can be movement of contaminated products, vehicles, or clothes. Your veterinarian might accidentally do this if they come onto your farm from another place where they had been dealing with a sick animal and they don't wash their boots or change their coveralls. Hunters might do this as they move through your property. They may have been at another place where they interacted with the livestock and then moved on to your property without thinking about maybe giving their boots a quick rinse or changing their clothes. Most notably, I think we all can recognize that poor biosecurity will be commingling of animals without any kind of quarantine period, feeding contaminated feedstuffs, having poor mortality management. So if you happen to have a disease go through and you have a big die-off of animals, or you happen to have a predator issue and you have had a series of livestock killed, to just leave those livestock out in the open would attract more wildlife, more pests, more predators, which could bring in more pathogens. And then poor pest management in general. So anything that kind of invites wildlife, mice, raccoons, bear onto your property can be another potential avenue of bringing pathogens onto the property. But because we know what poor biosecurity is, then we can think about how we can disrupt that disease spread or that disease movement. So we know what can bring pathogens onto our property. So let's think about how those pathogens can actually get on those items in order to facilitate that movement to another property. So when we talk about what influences disease spread, we have pathogen load, which is how much pathogen, a virus, bacteria, fungi, parasite, so how much pathogen is present in a particular space, either in an infected animal or in a contaminated area. We want to know exposure, which is the number of opportunities to contact with that pathogen. So if that pathogen is just happened to be on a feeder and you're in a space with a lot of other surfaces and you don't touch the feeder, your chances of picking up that pathogen are fairly low. As well as time, and exposure and time usually go hand in hand. So time would be how much physical time you spend either near a potential exposure or in an area that has a high pathogen load. Time can be either direct exposure to a risk or the duration of that exposure. So of these influences that spread disease, there are some of them that are a little bit easier for us to control as compared to others. So for pathogen load, it's really difficult for us to control the pathogen load in a given space. This is predominantly because we don't necessarily know what pathogens are in that space, and we don't know how many are there. Most pathogens, when they replicate in a logarithmic fashion, so they ramp up their numbers very quickly. And so if we don't know when a pathogen entered into an area and we don't know how much was there to start with or how long it's been there, it's very difficult for us to make some kind of estimate on how much pathogen load is in a given space, at least not without doing some very costly testing that may or may not be accurate given the conditions. We also have a difficult time controlling how much time we actually spend in a given area that may be contaminated. So if you have to go work in your pig pen and you know that there are a couple pigs that are sick in there, well, those pigs have been moving the whole way around the pen and you have to go work in that pen. So you have to be in there for as long as the job requires. So it's difficult to control or prevent how much time you're going to spend around a given pathogen. Exposure, on the other hand, does give us some limited control, and it is fairly cost effective. Exposure, again, is opportunities of contact with the pathogen. And that exposure is both in picking up a pathogen, say on our boots, as well as exposure on the other side by wearing those same boots into another area where that pathogen might come off of those boots and into a new area. So with exposure, we can actually provide some limited control that can help us keep pathogens in one particular area of the farm or off the farm altogether, as opposed to carrying it around from place to place. So now that we've kind of talked about what pathogens are, a little bit about how they move, let's take another step back and get back up just a little bit. Biosecurity refers to everything that is done to keep diseases and pathogens that carry them, viruses, bacteria, fungi, parasites, and other organisms, away from livestock, property, and people. So this is as defined by the USDA. I kind of wanted to highlight the key phrases here. And the key phrases are to keep diseases and pathogens that carry them away from livestock, property, and people. That's the whole key of biosecurity. And because the idea is to keep it away from these things, we can use a lot of physical interventions to keep those diseases and pathogens away from our livestock, property, and people. And this is where our clean, dirty line comes in that I mentioned in the beginning. Implementing biosecurity is a series of thought out placements of clean, dirty lines, lines of separation, and implementation of quarantines and downtime. It is not, so I went to go onto the farm, and just because I got onto the farm, I sprayed my boots, and then I went right into the pen that was on the opposite side of the clean, dirty line. Now that is effective biosecurity if you're able to create that specific straight line, which we will talk about that. If you're not able to create that specific line, it needs to be a concept and a process. It needs to be I need to transition something from either a clean space or a dirty space to the other side, and what that transition actually looks like. But first we'll go over a couple terms. So the vocabulary of biosecurity: definition of clean, definition of dirty, definition of line of separation, and then downtime or quarantine. So clean is anything, place, or person that is deemed an area of control, where biosecurity measures are implemented to prevent contamination. So clean does not mean that it is free of dust necessarily, that it is free of outside exposure necessarily. It means in biosecurity that it's an area where some level of control has been established to minimize or eliminate pathogen exposure and disease spread. Dirty, on the other hand, is anything, place, or person that has been deemed an area out of control, where contamination is possible or likely. So in this scenario where clean is anything that is placed in an area of control and dirty is anywhere in an area out of control, we could consider an area out of control would be a storefront where you don't know who's coming in there necessarily or where they have been. Or it could be visiting with or going to the vet clinic. So you went to the vet clinic, you don't know where anyone that has been there has been before, and it's pretty notorious that vet clinics have sick animals in there. So there's a good chance that there's some disease or pathogen that's in that location. So that's kind of what dirty is there's no level of control in that particular place.
Elizabeth, just to that point, we have a question here about maybe what are some of the most common diseases seen in pastured pork operations, and where do they typically arise or originate from?
Typical diseases in pastured pork operations. So some of the most common complaints I've heard from pastured pork operations are their pigs get a little bit of a cough. So not really a defined disease, but a respiratory ailment of some kind. Their pigs are thin in some cases. They're not necessarily getting the correct nutrition. Or parasites. Parasites are a particularly large issue. And so for parasites, a lot of the clean, dirty aspect is one, you want to try and keep those parasites out of particular areas. And if they do get in there, you want to establish some level of cleaning or control to return your holding space for your pigs to a state of clean or a minimum parasite state. In general, though, I actually don't know too many pastured pig operations that would say they struggle with specific diseases. I haven't heard too many reports of the exact same disease where you're struggling with a specific disease. I'll take our operation at Penn State has sows out on pasture. Our sows are out on pasture 365 days a year. They do farrow in a building, and then we breed them. They farrow and lactate in a building, and then after they're confirmed pregnant, they go back out to pasture. But we have sows outside all the time. And our sows struggle with brucellosis. So brucellosis can be spread from groundhogs and leptospirosis as well. And so our pigs have an exceptional level of exposure to groundhogs. We actually spend a lot of time trying to remove the groundhogs from the property because they spread those diseases around. And so that would be two specific diseases that pastured operations could struggle with, but I've not heard too many bring up specific diseases that they struggle with, whether they don't know what it is, they've never looked into it, or they just don't bring it up to me. So that is a good question, though.
Great, thank you.
So implementing biosecurity, kind of like my groundhog example, we spend an exceptional amount of time managing the groundhog population for the farm at Penn State. So we are taking our pastures and establishing a level of control in those pastures to try and clean them of potential vectors of diseases that we have issues with, leptospirosis and brucellosis. So because of that particular situation, we are establishing a biosecurity protocol through managing our groundhog population on the property. And because of that, that allows us to take our pastures from a state of dirty to a state of clean. So implementing biosecurity most easily is surrounding this line of separation concept. If you are able to dedicate a physical space on your farm where everything beyond this line, a line drawn in the sand, in the picture, this lady's changing into a pair of boots from a mat, a physical doorway, if you are able to orient your farm around a physical line, that is the original concept of a line of separation. For your operations, where those animals are reared outside, that line of separation is going to be where you can establish control versus where you can't or are not able to establish control. So for you, that line of separation might look like a perimeter fence. That line of separation might look like a driveway edge. That line of separation might be entirely imaginary, where you don't let anyone cross so far beyond the edge of the barn in order to prevent certain people from moving in other areas. So line of separation is that place of transition, though it does look very different for every farm. And then finally, implementing biosecurity means creating separation, and this can include with time. And this is probably one of the most important tools of biosecurity for pastured pork operations is honoring quarantine and downtime. So downtime and quarantine is a period of time as the clock changes, minutes pass, seconds pass, days pass, where potentially contaminated things, animals, people, or locations are separated from other things, animals, so that pathogens can die off. This is really the only way to genuinely decontaminate anything that is organic. So any animals or people or organic matter. This can take a few days to months depending on the pathogen. But for animals in general, your veterinarian will very commonly recommend 30-day quarantine when you bring in a new animal. 30-day quarantine is enough time for, if that animal caught something the day they left the farm, it's a couple weeks to incubate, and then they should show symptoms within 30 days so that you know whether or not they're ill. In our current situation with the pandemic, 2 weeks have been recommended for human quarantine time. So if you were exposed to COVID-19, they expect that symptoms should show in about 2 weeks. That's the exact same concept.
Beth, backing up a minute, we have a question here. Karen is curious about, on the Penn State farm, what are some of the methods used to reduce or eliminate groundhogs?
Some of the methods that are used are trapping. There are some other methods that are approved and some that are not. The most commonly used method is trapping those groundhogs. The guys have probably 8 to 20 traps depending on time of the year that they set, and then they go check those traps every day and eliminate the groundhogs after they've been captured. They told me one summer that they caught 88 groundhogs in a summer. So we have a particularly bad problem right up next to the university, and I'm not 100% sure why it's so bad there. But trapping a lot of them on your own property, you'd probably be allowed to utilize a gun if you're a good shot, or some kind of poison. We can't use poison because they're actually capturing them in the pasture, and we don't want the pigs to get at the poison. Hopefully that answers your question. So quarantine and downtime. So for animals, we hold them in quarantine to see if they show any symptoms. If you have a location and you're able to wash it, so if you have a pen that you're able to wash, that can ensure that things are clean to start with. But having additional downtime and quarantine will allow pathogens to die off in the instance that you've missed certain areas, so you didn't get it as clean as you thought you could. Or if you're unable to clean a pen, quarantine and downtime are really useful tools in minimizing pathogen loads. All right, so those are the key vocabulary, the key words for practicing biosecurity. But clearly those are designed around a situation where you have total control over what goes in and out of your barn. In your situation, you're not going to necessarily have that. We just talked about groundhogs. Managing wildlife is something that's a little bit more difficult and not quite so black and white. Wildlife are going to cross lines all the time. So it's more about establishing some level of control to minimize that pathogen exposure. So when we're talking about cleaning, it's again establishing some level of control over a given space, person, or place or location. So for cleaning routines, this is a daily chore, and it can be pretty difficult for pigs that are housed outside. So outdoor production is dirty, plain and simple. It's muddy in the springtime, it's dusty in the summertime, there's ice and snow in the winter and salt from the road and more dirt that just seems to crop up from places that we didn't know dirt could be. If buildings are separated, it can be pretty easy to clean things and keep things separate in one area or farm or the other. Or it could be difficult because often your buildings are separated, but you have to run from chore to chore to chore. And it can be additionally difficult because labor and supplies are tight. So I can understand that daily dirt is pretty easy to overlook. But making sure that you prioritize it in your daily routine is a really good and best practice step to minimizing the spread of any pathogen. So I have a picture of a couple boots here. These are my boots that I have at my house. The boots in the top, those cowboy boots, I wear all the time. And when I wore them this spring, I happened to get some mud caked up underneath them. The other boots down at the bottom are the ones I wear around the property. We're on the side of a mountain, so we get a lot of the water down near the house, and there's a couple muddy spots. And even then, these boots they're dirty, but they're not totally caked in mud. And it's easy to forget that dirt is in that location. So making it a habit to clean every day, and cleaning your footwear and cleaning your clothes is one of that first step, that even though it's chaotic and it takes time, making that a daily habit is that first step in your operation. So I bring that up to say that keeping clean is a daily habit for us in general. Personal hygiene is one way in keeping pathogens from spreading around a farm by starting with keeping ourselves clean. So I mentioned that when I got on here that my hair was wet. I weighed pigs this morning. Our farm at Penn State, we don't have a shower in, shower out facility. We have our biosecurity set up by once you cross onto the property, you have to step onto a mat to clean off your shoes. There's extensive downtime before you can even get onto the property. But once you're there, you have to step on a mat to clean off your shoes. You have to put on coveralls or change. You have to put on barn boots. You have to wash your hands before you go deal with the pigs. We have a series of steps to clean ourselves before we actually go to the farm. And then when we leave the farm, you do that process in reverse. And I take the additional step of when I go home, I make sure I take a shower right away. I almost always try to go home right after going to the farm to shower right away and put those clothes that I wore to the farm into the laundry hamper. That's just one way for me to kind of isolate whatever pathogens I might have picked up while I was on the farm and keep them from spreading to other farms as I go visit other farms. Washing hands, again, wash between tasks. If you have to start your morning off and you start your morning off in the farrowing barn, it's always a good idea to kind of give your hands a quick wash before you go visit your nursery pigs. Or if you had to go fix fence for 4 or 5 hours and now it's time to go feed pigs, it's always good practice to give your hands a good wash, good rinse before you go feed your pigs now, to prevent that spread of any potential pathogens that you might not know are in one area or the other. And then washing your clothes. Washing clothes routinely can wear them out, but it does help get that pathogen load off of there. So again, we talked about how much pathogen, how long pathogens are on something. The more often you wash clothes, the more you're going to reduce any given pathogen load on a particular item, and the more you're going to reduce that potential exposure or time exposure of that pathogen to either yourself or your animals. When we talk about cleaning our buildings, the buildings and equipment are going to be focused much more around removing organic matter, getting air moving, and being patient. So that time factor. So if you are able to remove any bedding from a given space, expose any porous surfaces, remove clutter, and if you're able to wash it, wash it. If you're not able to wash it, then don't. But getting all of the clutter off of it and the organic matter off is a really important step. Get air moving. If you can open up all of your solid doors, open up windows, put a fan in the window, put an exhaust fan on the other side, and get air moving through a building, that is a really great way to help dry and clean that building out, to move some of the dust particles that are in the air out to disrupt any habitats that those pathogens might be living in, to disrupt their living area, will facilitate in those pathogens dying off and reducing that pathogen load. And then, of course, quarantining and being patient. Once you bring those pigs, it can be a pain in the neck to have them in a completely different part of your farm in a quarantine space where you have to treat them a little bit differently. But it's worth the time taking to see if those animals get sick, to prevent bringing any kind of illness onto your main herd. It takes a whole lot less time to quarantine the 25 pigs you brought home than it's going to be to have to call in the vet and treat the 100 pigs that you have on your property now because 25 of them brought something in and got the other 75 sick.
Beth, we have a question here from Shanna, who's wondering how effective bright sunlight and UV rays are killing some of the common pathogens. She says they often lay things out in the sun to try and sterilize.
Yeah, absolutely. I have another slide to bring that up. Sunshine is fantastic. If you can get good UV rays on anything, it will help break it down, but it will take time. So UV radiation denatures DNA. It breaks down DNA, but it requires that breakdown process to happen over time. So that those pathogens need to be exposed to that direct sunlight probably for a few days if we're talking a building. If we're talking a fresh wash surface, as soon as it's dry, it's fine. So if you wash, it sounded like the question, you wash things and lay them out in the sun to dry. I wash my clothes and I lay them, or I hang them on the line to dry. Once they're dry, they're fine. But if you have a building and you've just cleaned a lot of bedding out, having that building completely open and allowing any sunshine that you can get in there to kind of beat down on that flooring and those walls, those wood feeders for a few days to even a month is a really good idea, because it's going to take time for that sun to really work on that organic material and break it down.
Great, thank you.
So I mentioned that we visited Brooks Farm last week, and I did take some pictures of a couple locations on the farm. I didn't take too many pictures. And I brought this one up, and he apologized when I looked in there, and I said, no, this is great, because it's a bank barn. Bank barns are great for keeping things cool, but they're also usually pretty dark, and that's usually to the negative. That's usually a bad thing. I like this picture of Brooks' pen here, because I think that there's actually some really good aspects for it. But I'm going to ask you all a question first. And I know it's a little bit difficult to weigh in here, but maybe you can put it in the chat and Franklin can tell me what your answer is. Do you think this is clean or dirty? Or maybe more accurately, do you think it could be easily cleaned, or do you think it's just too dirty and it just cannot be cleaned?
So we've got a vote for clean and a vote for a bit of both. And Brooks is saying that someone needs to fix some plumbing.
That's fair. That's fair. Sometimes things happen. So the way I look at this is it's actually pretty clean. Given that this is an old bank barn, I just took this picture with my cell phone. It wasn't the brightest place in there when we looked in there, but there is enough light to get cell phone picture clarity. So that's great. He had all the doors open when we were there, so there's some air movement through there. If you wanted to stick a fan in one of those windows, that would help more air movement through there, but that tells me that you can get air movement in there and it can be dried out. So we did happen to visit his farm during this dry spell that we've been having, well, at least we've been having in North Central PA and in Perry County. I'm not sure about some other parts of the state. This dry spell that we had over the past couple weeks. So things were particularly dry. But even so, bank barns tend to stay cool and wet. And this barn was still, for the most part, pretty dry. I can see in this picture, I can see that the beams are exposed here. So I can see the floor in this particular pen. I can see down to the baseboards on this fencing, and I can see down to the connection of the posts here on the ground. I can see the wood exposed here across the ground. All of that exposure and maybe a little bit more cleaning up from some of the organic matter, all of that is getting exposed to the air that's moving around. So even though this isn't brand new materials, it's not all metal, so it's not all washable necessarily, it can all be exposed to air and it can all get dried out. And so that's a really key and important note here for keeping biosecurity in some of these older facilities. You want to be able to get them empty. You want to be able to get air moving into them, and you want to be able to get them dry. I think the hardest thing that Brooks would have in this particular facility, besides the plumbing work that needs done, is getting sunshine into it. That's going to be the hardest part, is getting legitimate sunshine in there. But getting good airflow would help dry it out significantly. And because all of these particular nooks and cranny areas are exposed, drying those out before putting another group of pigs in there would be a great step in the right direction in improving biosecurity and reducing spread of any pathogens. So I took this picture too. I really like the creativity here. This is an old barn that I believe, Brooks, you said this was a farrowing barn, and it had caught fire, and so you moved it to a different part of the farm. So on the outside, this is a metal barn. It's a little bit rusty, so we do have to worry about some tetanus issues there if it's too bad, but it is in a dry location. And what I liked about it a little bit more than that was that it was simple. It's not, when you got into this barn, there were a lot of things laying around. There's not a lot of built-in nook and cranny areas for things to hide. It was pretty much just a straight building with some of these supports across the bottom. That helps, again, in your ability to clean that barn out and to get it dry. In this particular space, there was some good sunlight that came in a couple of those holes. There were some trees over top, so it wasn't going to get maximum sunshine, but it was placed in a location where it wasn't going to flood out unless there was an extreme rain event. And even if it did, it could be cleaned out completely and allowed to dry as empty. And that, again, is going to be a really great step in the right direction in keeping pathogens at bay. The ability to remove all of that organic matter and then allow that building to dry out. While we were at Brooks's farm, I raved about his feeder. I thought this was a fantastic feeder. And we talked about it being a little bit too full. Pigs destroy things. There's nothing you can really do about that. But this feeder, I think, is great for a pastured operation because it has two things. One, it has these metal skids, that keep really good clearance from the ground to the bottom of that feeder. If I had to guess, I'd say it was easily 4 to 5 inches, probably higher from the ground. And so that allows for water to get underneath there, but it's not going to get up against the metal and rust that out. It's not going to get the feed wet and cause the feed to grow any kind of fungi or to have bacteria get into that feed. And these sleds that are on it also allowed it to move really easily across the ground, so Brooks can move it routinely. It doesn't get stuck in one spot because it's too hard to move. The other thing about this feeder that I liked a lot is that it had a cover on the top. So you can get those round feeders that have covers on the top, but it might just be a screw cap or it might just be a lid, and those are okay. As long as you can keep the water out of it. So keeping good attention on how well covered your feed is will help reduce the potential pathogens and contaminants that might get into your feed out on pasture, and it provides you some level of control over that feeder. The thing that would be difficult to control here is this open space. And we did talk a little bit about that, potentially having some kind of cover on there, but pigs rip the covers off. This would be the one area where you'd want to pay some attention to because of birds. This slope here is going to keep water out of it for the most part. However, you're going to have a hard time keeping birds out of it. So maybe going through on a daily basis and mixing the feed up a little bit and pulling that top layer of feed off, or keeping as little feed in there as you can, as is reasonable, so that you can clean it out every once in a while, again, to reduce that pathogen load. So if you'll notice, for the facilities and equipment, I've talked about drying things out a lot. Drying or keeping things dry is going to be your best friend in a pastured operation. Why? Because pathogens need water content. You can wash and disinfect things to your heart's content, but unless you get it dry, you are going to struggle with pathogens routinely coming back, or your disinfectant not doing any good, or that wash just turning everything into cakey mud. You have to get your equipment dry in order for it to truly be effective to keep that pathogen load down. If you want to scrub tools or sweep and wash heavy traffic areas, you want to pay attention to porous and non-porous surfaces. Make sure to clean those appropriately. But again, in the end, it just needs to be dry. You all are dealing with a lot of soil. You can't clean soil, but you can help it dry out. You can manage where your animals are to allow that water to evaporate out or to drain, so that soil can dry out and give those pathogens less of an ideal situation to live in. Disinfectants included. Disinfectants only work on clean surfaces, and they only work when allowed time to dry. There are some disinfectants that can work while still liquid, but they still need time. And so having that dry mentality, making sure that everything you use is dry, is going to really improve your pathogen load and improve your disease risk levels. So reduce the amount of disease risk on your property. And somebody brought up sunshine. So UV radiation damages DNA. I've worked in a lab for a number of years, and we weren't allowed to have the window shades open a lot of the time when we were working with DNA and RNA, because that's how sensitive those materials are to sunlight. Bacteria, fungi, viruses, those are very small molecules, and they have high exposure of their RNA DNA. So sunlight can put a lot of damage on those pathogens and their ability to spread disease. Reducing water content can also damage those pathogens, and it can also damage DNA, but both do require time to be effective. I use this picture of West Texas out here. I lived just north of this particular Cap Rock picture when I lived in Texas for a few years, and they grow cotton out there because cotton doesn't have the same pathogen load in Lubbock, Texas as it does, say, in Georgia. And that's because of humidity differences. So again, keeping things dry will help significantly reduce pathogen loads. And that applies to land too. So we want to keep our equipment dry. We want to keep our houses dry, our barns dry, but it also applies to land. If you have pastures that don't have any grass on them and that are just overflowing with mud all the time, you're going to have a hard time with pathogen load. You're going to have higher levels of parasite load. You're going to have higher risk factors for bacteria being in the water. So if you can, orient your pastures to allow you to put animals high and dry. Brooks has these great rolling pastures on his property. And when we were there, the pigs were on some of the higher levels of pasture. Now, granted, again, I said that it was dry while we were there, but even so, he put them in a place where the water is going to run off of those pastures. It's not really going to pool there, and that's going to minimize the amount of mud on the property. So keeping mud to a minimum will reduce that overall pathogen load. Don't overgraze your pastures. Keep the grass growing there. Don't damage the land. And you've, again, taken another step in the right direction to reduce that overall pathogen load. And so then for biosecurity, if we're working to keep things clean and dry it out, we also want to keep things separate. So if you have items that you're wearing on the barn and wearing in the barn and interacting with your animals every day, you want to keep barn clothes, a coat, barn boots, hat, or gloves. Your equipment in the barn, keep it in the barn. You wouldn't wear that barn jacket to church unless maybe you were in a hurry. So even if you are in a hurry, take a couple seconds to leave it at the barn, because then you aren't transporting anything off of your farm that could be exposed to somebody else that they might carry home, or vice versa. Nobody else, if somebody did wear their barn jacket to church, you're not picking that up and carrying it to your home farm. Franklin, I think I had the time that we had another 30 minutes, or am I wrong here? I feel like I'm taking too long.
We have it scheduled to 1:30.
Okay, thank you. So finally, so I'll pause for just a couple questions or comments if Brooks has any, because next we're going to move into traffic patterns on your farm. So how you actually move around the farm. So does anybody have any questions from the previous content?
I guess maybe I'm curious about, maybe you get some responses from some of the folks on the line, but you know, Brooks has a pretty great setup in terms of the topography and also the soils for keeping things dry. Beth, I'm wondering, you know, you have some experience in situations where, you know, the soils don't drain as well, other strategies people can have to work with the land to keep things dry.
Yeah, and I think I've mentioned, at least I've mentioned it to you, this is where I get a little bit of a handicap because I'm a pig expert, not a pasture expert. From the pasture management and nutrient management extension specialists that we have at Penn State, I've talked to them a little bit about this, and they talk about things like animal concentration areas. They talk about one of our educators just put I'm going to mess it up. It just put out an education piece on high traffic areas for cattle. So you could put down padding to kind of improve your soil and reduce compaction if you have a lot of cattle on a particular space. So, and the equine group also has something similar. So they have that high traffic, high animal use area padding that can be put down and reduce compaction. Some of those things, because pigs aren't quite as heavy, if you can get them where pigs their feet won't fall through them, those high area use pads will reduce the amount of damage pigs can do to the soil in a particular spot. I would think in most of the pasture operations, which this might be an assumption on my part, most of the people I've talked with are actively trying to move their pigs as much as possible, because the goal is to have the pig in there. That pig is going to either rip out some of the grass, chew on some of the grass, walk it down, and then they don't come back to that paddock for a while. So if you're in an area where you have a lot of mud, but you're able to rotate, do rotate, and maybe rotate more aggressively than in some spaces where it's particularly dry. So I mentioned Brooks has a nice setup. He's got a lot of rolling pastures, and Franklin mentioned the soil. So his rotation setup is based around kind of what the grass looks like. But if you're in a wet scenario and you have to manage mud more often, base it on how your soils look after those pigs have been on there for a couple of days. If they're really starting to rut it up a lot and they're putting a lot of damage into the soil itself, and there's a lot of wallows and there's torn up grass patches that are just straight mud now, move them off of it sooner if you're able to do that. And if you're not, those high use pads would probably be something to look into.
Karen is asking how often you rotate your pigs at the Penn State facility. I know those pastures are on more of a, you know, a clay Hagerstown soil. And she's also commenting that wood chips can be really effective with that, minimizing mud and compaction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so wood chips is a good suggestion. At Penn State, traditionally the swine group has not practiced rotation on our pastures. Instead, they practice the animal concentration area concept. So we have some very, very large lots that our sows are on. There's 16.25 acres on the entire lot of land that we have. And our pastures take up easily 12 or more of those acres. And we only have 65 sows. So what we have are some exceptionally large pastures. We put, say, no more than 6 sows out on a pasture at a time. And then when those sows go into farrow, they're pulled off of that pasture, and that pasture is given some time to rest, but we don't actually rotate. That's something that we've discussed a little bit about. We know that there's some research that needs to happen there. We just need to get the right experts involved. So we are looking into it so that we could have some more recommendations based on those soil types. But right now, we just accept that our sows are going to damage a portion of the pasture, and as long as the rest of the pasture is kept in good shape, which they are, usually we have very good grass cover on the rest of the pasture, we've accepted that high animal use situation. Great questions. You guys are giving me a lot of good ideas.
And Karen is also wondering if anybody is incorporating biochar into bedding to reduce odors or help manage flies and hence pathogens.
I don't know anyone using biochar as of yet. I've seen a couple articles on biochar, but I don't know specifically of anyone that's using any biochar. You all might have a little bit more experience with that than I do.
Brooks, do you want to tell us a little bit about your experience with it?
Yeah, so we don't use it regularly, but we use it to start the inoculated deep litter system. So I don't know if we want to wait to the end to talk about that.
You can talk about that.
Okay, cool. So yeah, so there's links on the comments over there. The top one is for the NRCS article on it, and the next one down is like a YouTube video of Michael DuPont, which is the guy who I've been in touch with the most about getting this going. And this is the picture that Beth has up here, is one of our setups that we have had going for, this is the longest one, so it's about 8 years, 7 or 8 years now that we've had it. The idea is you've got bedding in here, you've got lots of bedding. So there's about 2.5 feet worth of bedding, but it never grows. You never have to remove it. And this is based on Korean natural farming, which is kind of, supposedly centuries old, and it was popularized by a guy who they call Master Cho, and he's cited in the work of Michael DuPont on that NRCS thing. This system, this inoculated deep litter system, is now an NRCS approved manure management technique. So it's like, been researched long enough that we know it works. We were the first one, according to Mike, that used it in a cold climate outside of Korea. And the idea is the biochar is the base. So we put about a ton of biochar in the base of this 70-foot hoop house. Above the biochar are logs. So we did this one all with logs, both hardwood and softwood logs. It takes a lot of logs to fill a 70-foot by 30-foot space. And then green chop, which we used we just bought in baleage. So you could, you know, if you're in Hawaii, obviously you just go out and chop down a bunch of banana trees or something and you chuck it in there and you have a whole bunch of really active composting stuff. But we bought some baleage, rolled it out in there, and then covered it with straw. So that's the environment that you set up, and then the inoculant that you add into the whole thing is the secondary part of it. And that we actually just started our second batch of, and it's effectively like moldy rice that you put in the woods. So you take a batch of rice, you cook up soft cooked rice, you put it out in the woods in a really undisturbed spot. So you want real native woods, not a spot where pigs have been rooting, because that's going to affect the little, you know, biodiversity in that area. And then after 4 or 5 days, you go out and you pull it up out of the soil, and you've got this really moldy, funky looking rice. You mix the rice with sugar. That gets the microbes kind of activated and fired up, and they multiply. And then you transition them back onto, after about 4 or 5 days of fermentation, you transition them back onto, we used rice hulls, but you could use barley hulls, which people use in brewing. They're pretty readily available. Rice hulls are used in brewing too, so they're pretty easy to find. And then mix it back with soil and inoculate it onto the straw that goes on top of the bedding. The reason that you're doing all that is because you're essentially mimicking the forest floor ecosystem. So you're giving those same microbes, you're introducing them into the system that you've created with the logs, which is just tons of carbon. You know, the green chop gave you some of those microbes from the green living stuff, and then you throw in the stuff that you get from the forest soil. The biochar I think of as a database, like a microbial database. You know, biochar, the thing that works, it's got a lot of carbon in it, but it's also got lots of microscopic spaces in it. And so I think of it as you're creating a space for all these microbes to live in. And when they get called upon to decompose manure or urine or the carbon in the straw or whatever, they can come decompose that stuff and kind of go back into their, biochar space afterwards. So we've had this one going for, like I said, 7 or 8 years. We never have pigs in it continuously because we only use it really for the winter, and we used to use it for farrowing. But we've added straw in it every winter for that long, and we've never taken bedding out of it. And the ones in Hawaii, they've had going for, I think, 15 years now. So 2006 or 7, so 13 years. And he said the same thing. They've never had to remove bedding. So the initial setup is a lot of labor and a lot of, it's intensive, but think about every single batch of hogs that you would put in, if this were a confinement facility, every single batch of hogs, you'd be scraping manure out, or, you'd have a big manure pit. You don't have any wet manure to deal with or anything like that. Doesn't smell. And that's something I guess I would say, after we had our visit, I kind of thought about it. And for me, I think like biosecurity has kind of evolved like in the back of my mind without thinking of it this way, as essentially like follow your nose. For us, like you can smell when it's wet, you can smell when it's like anaerobic and funky and nasty, and that's probably a bad spot to have your pigs. And so this is covered, this whole space is covered. Some of the cover was off when everyone visited the farm, and we're taking the whole thing off because we're giving this area a rest for a full year, kind of a UV sterilization thing. And we put some cover crops in here because we did have some pigs who would go into this space and then come out coughing. So we figured we had some kind of parasite, some kind of microbe that was in there that was causing some issues. But yeah, you want it to be dry. It's not like a normal compost. The pigs are adding moisture in their manure and in their urine. And I swear, like, it's so different having animals in a space like this than just like a bedding pack. You go into a bedding pack and every day you throw your straw down, and it's like, it kind of stinks. It's like, if you open it up a little bit, it's compacted down and it smells anaerobic underneath there. But this had that nice aerobic smell to it always. My kids, I'd feel fine with my kids walking through there and, sitting down in it and like I swear the manure would be gone in like a day. It was just nuts, you know. And so we had 70 pigs in there for one winter, and that we're doing the same thing in 2 other spaces on the farm. One of which is a banked greenhouse, and the other of which is that zombie apocalypse looking shipping container that we showed earlier. That's going to get the bottom filled in with wood chips. And somebody asked about wood chips. We're using wood chips in that system because it's just going to be too hard to get logs in there. And so I totally think you could use wood chips. We just had a lot of logs because we were cutting down. We had like 5,000 feet of fence going through woods, so we had tons of logs, and we just figured we'd cut them up and throw them in there. It turns out both wood chips and logs, it's hard to fill a volume of space like with manually putting things in there. So even with the wood chips, it takes forever to fill up a space with wood chips.
Brooks, we have a question here about how much biochar per square foot, and just kind of generally the upfront investment to set this up in terms of costs.
I bought the biochar. I literally bought 2 like kind of super sack totes, those big, you know, 1-ton totes. And we just basically put, you know, like a 1/4-inch dusting over the whole space before we put the logs in. And that was one of those things where Michael was kind of like, you know, I asked him the same thing, like, how much should we use? And he's like, you like cover it, you know, when it looks good, you should be good. And so I don't think there's a formula, but you know, one thing that we're definitely going to do, we've had pigs in areas where we've had kind of like fires and things like that, and the pigs eat charred wood all the time and charcoal. And so that's one thing that we're considering, is literally like making biochar and just having it available in all the spaces that pigs move into. You know, it helps. It's good for detoxing, for digestive systems and things like that. And I don't think it would hurt to offer it. And we've seen them eating it all the time whenever we're in a spot where we've like had a fire or something like that. So yeah, I'd say it's a big investment up front, you know, but this is one thing I always say to our whenever we have a conversation about, you know, confinement pigs versus pigs on pastures. Like, it's not an all or nothing deal. Like, you could totally have a system like this and be in full confinement, and I think it's a lot more environmentally friendly, and the pigs love it. The pigs love rooting through this stuff and digging down to some of the wood and things like that. So I'm a firm believer. There's a bunch of other stuff in the Korean natural farming system too, like fermented plant juices and things like that are really natural ways to treat livestock and for plants and things like that. So
great, thanks. And Karen's just pointing out there's a lot of resources online for making your own biochar, which is time consuming, but can be cheaper. And that also, there has been quite a bit of research to show that biochar can help livestock stay healthy and gain weight in terms of eating it.
Yeah, so that's some great feedback. And from a biosecurity perspective, like I said, I don't know too much about this bedding in general or about compost, but we've actually talked quite a bit about composting in application with diseases that are of concern globally. I don't know if any of you paid too much attention to the African swine fever concerns that kind of came up a couple years ago, almost at this point. So African swine fever is still circulating in China, and the United States swine industry at large is quite concerned about it. It would be pretty devastating to the pig population across the country. It doesn't matter how you house your pigs, it would be a really devastating disease. It would be one of those ones that once you get it in, it is actually pretty difficult to get out. But because of that conversation, they've had to deal with, well, what happens if we have that disease come through and we have a high mortality event? What do we do with those mortalities in order to kill the virus quickly? And one of the conversations that comes up routinely, at least in Pennsylvania, given our topography, and not in lack of ability to centralize mortalities the way they can out in West, is composting. Because composting can get hot enough to kill pathogens. And so that's one of those things about this bed pack or this inoculated deep bedding system, I'd be curious, and it doesn't sound like they talk too much about that, and Brooks, maybe you can answer this, is how hot does it get? Because once it reaches, I believe it's 140 degrees Fahrenheit, compost can kill off African swine fever, and African swine fever is one of the harder viruses to kill off. And so it's killing off all other pathogens in the midst as it's heating to that temperature. So Brooks, do you know, does this put off any heat?
Not really, no. It stays pretty consistently kind of ground temperature. And I think, you know, Michael DuPont would be the guy to ask about this stuff because he's got so much more experience with it. But my understanding from him is that it's more of a kind of a competition thing, that the environment that you're creating and the inoculant that you put in there is kind of overwhelming the system with all these good microbes in the soil. But I'd say, you know, I would ask him, you know, he's an extension agent at Hawaii, and I bet you he's got, I'm sure they've talked about it since they're, you know, an island in the Pacific and closer than any state is to China.
Yeah, so that's a good point, and that is a great point in contrast, because when we first talked about this, I thought composting, but that's a great point in contrast. So something to consider. Whereas this system might help keep specific pathogens low from a diversity aspect, composting would eliminate pathogens from a heating and decontamination aspect. But again, it's about how you manage it. I'm not really going to advocate for one or the other because I don't know that much about composting or this system, but it's great options to look into. So I am going to show a couple quick things about biosecure movements on farm. So we do only have a few minutes, so I'm going to skip some of my pictures. And feel free to interrupt me with questions. But we talked about keeping your animals healthy and how to minimize those pathogens on farm. But one of the biggest risks is actually movement. So who comes onto your farm and who comes off? And we talked a little bit about this with Brooks, and I'm sure some of you have similar situations where you have your customers come onto the farm, either routinely because that's how they come and get their product, or every once in a while as big events. And some of those things you might want to consider, either asking them to have downtime or keeping them from certain areas. And I'll highlight some of that in some of these pictures. First, I like to pick on the Penn State farm. It's our farm, it's here for demonstration. And it's got a lot of funky, unique aspects to it that not other people have. So when you have your site and you want to organize traffic, it's good to separate clothes and shoes, like we mentioned earlier, but it's also good to organize your housing and your pig chores and how people physically move through the site. So for our site, we have a rule that when we go to do chores, we always check farrowing first, then nursery, then we move out to the older pigs. That's not to say that we never go back to farrowing and nursery later in the day, but we do those first. That way, if we know something is wrong, we can address that right away before we go address the other pigs. And we kind of keep our cleanest selves in interacting with those youngest animals with the most naive immune system. Outside of that, we try to keep non-resident animals and humans away from our pigs. We're a university system, so people do come onto our site on a routine basis. And then we kind of think about how we move on the farm to try and keep certain people off of certain areas. One thing I'm going to highlight in particular here is this road interaction that we have at our farm. So to kind of orient you, if you've been on Penn State's campus or you've been to a football game, Beaver Stadium is up this way. So this is Porter Road. It goes right by Beaver Stadium. During football games, that road is backed up. You can't get down that road during a football game. Our paddocks are right here. So this is that outer perimeter fence to all of our paddocks, and this is where the sows live. And then here's like a grassy area between the road and our paddocks. This grassy area fills up with people during football game. People love to walk up here and feed our pigs things. They like to hop the fence and take pictures with the pigs. They like to reach in and give the pigs scratches and scratch their nose and whatnot. So that's a concern for us during football games, because a couple 100,000 people show up to State College for a football game. We don't know where they're from. We can't keep them from trying to feed our pigs things, and we don't know if that food could make those pigs sick. So we try to manage this during football season by discouraging people from going up to the property. So there's a gate here that we lock with a biosecurity sign. And then we'll take the pigs off of these paddocks, and these paddocks rest during football season. There are no pigs that reside on these paddocks during football season. Luckily, we have the space to do that, but that's a time specific movement that we do to discourage people from interacting with our animals when we don't know what they're going to do. If this were a farm where you're having people come visit, you might not have a choice, and you might have to keep your animals in that situation. So instead, you could set back an additional perimeter fence to keep your pigs away from the edge if you don't want people to touch them, or more simply, ask people to participate in your biosecurity. If the goal is to keep your animals healthy, I would think most of your visitors would appreciate that, because they don't want things in their food like antibiotics or antivirals or additional medications to keep animals healthy. They just want them to be healthy. So ask them to wash their hands. Ask them to utilize Tyvek suits and boots before interacting with your animals. And I have a couple overhead pictures here of some farms. These are farms that I know, personal knowledge of these farms, and experience on these farms. So not to single out anybody, this is definitely not Brooks Farm or anyone else, but I wanted to highlight some of these traffic patterns and some other areas of the farm that could be concerned in terms of biosecurity. So what I'm circling now, so when we have our traffic pattern here, and in this farm, it's really nicely situated where the barn part of this operation can be separated very cleanly from the driveway. So we have the house here, we have a sidewalk that goes to the barn here, and all of the farm animals are on this side of this red line. So it's pretty easy to keep people away from them. You have a very clean area to keep people away from your livestock. The bigger problem on this farm, I'll remove my lines here. The bigger problem on this farm is the amount of clutter everywhere. Clutter, which everyone likes to have spare parts on hand for your tractor. You like to have spare wagons because you got it for free and you're going to fix it up one day. The clutter on this farm, though, is a great habitat for raccoons, mice, rats, birds, things that are coming from off of your property that are notorious for carrying all kinds of really gross pathogens. And now they're going to be living in the clutter that's on the property. This is something that doesn't get talked about too often in biosecurity. Again, from the perspective of confinement pig housing, we're encouraged to keep properties clean, but the pigs for the most part are in a building. When you have your pigs outside and you have your farms exposed like this, whatever animals are living in this area are going to go to the barn for food, because they can get to it more easily because it's exposed to that outside environment, and then back again. And then they're going to mate and have babies and increase that rat population, and then the food's going to get challenged. So they're going to go off of the property and haul things off of the property, or they're going to come onto the property because they know there's a food source here and a housing source. So managing clutter on your property is one of those other great steps towards preventing any biosecurity issues and keeping that traffic to a minimum on your property, as opposed to just allowing both humans and wildlife to kind of come in and take over the property. I feel like I'm running out of time, so I'm trying to be a little bit
coming
quick.
up on 5 minutes here. Yep.
Sorry.
No worries.
So I did see the chat flash, so I'll kind of put a pause on it there. And if any of you have any more specific questions about property and traffic management, this is where it's really specific to your place. I have a couple pictures here, but for the most part, it's going to be specific to your location. And it's very hard to give advice outside of that. So since we were coming up right on time, and I didn't want to spend too much more time belaboring some of those topics, and it's a little difficult to talk about traffic without the other examples. I'll just put my contact information up here. We do have a Penn State Science Instagram page if you feel like following it, but if you have any other questions about your site for biosecurity specifically, or why is biosecurity important, if you want to practice it, how you could practice it on your site, please feel free to reach out. I'm really glad that Franklin organized this so that I could get a chance to talk to you all a little bit about this topic.